My grandfather retired as an engine driver from the Indian Railways. But that's not what makes him special. What makes him special is his habit of keeping unusual pets. Thanks to him, we had at home Tutu the monkey, whom he had rescued from the circus, and Popoy the parrot, whom he had found abandoned at a railway station. And because of this, Popoy could whistle like an engine. To this lively household, grandfather decided to add a python. We were living in Missouri at that time, and one Sunday morning, grandfather took me along with him to the village market, and together we purchased a python. Grandfather then slung it over his shoulder, and we walked back home to crowds of cheering children. But once home, all our excitement vanished because waiting for us was grandmother at the doorstep. And she, while she had made her peace with a monkey and a parrot, could not even tolerate a sweet-tempered lizard. So there was absolutely no chance for the python to find favor in her. Seeing grandfather and the python, she said, "Well, take that thing back. Find that man who sold it to you, tell him he can keep the money, but ask him to take it back." Grandfather knew there was absolutely no point arguing. So he carried that thing to the bathroom, dumped it onto the bathtub, locked the door, and went to find the snake charmer. I went along with him, of course, but we were not successful. We met many snake charmers who wanted to sell their snakes to us because they had heard that grandfather was buying snakes. But nobody wanted to buy a snake from us. As for the snake charmer who had sold the python to grandpa, he immediately went for his village in the hope of finding more pythons because he thought maybe grandfather might want them more. We came back, failed in our mission, and it was written quite loud and clear in our faces. And while grandmother sympathized with our efforts, she made it very clear that this thing still had to go. She said, "Well, you can take this, dump it somewhere near the forest so that it finds its way back to the wild." Well, that sounded pretty reasonable. So grandfather unbolted the door of the bathroom, went in to get the python, and surprise, surprise, no python. The python had climbed up, crawled out through the open window, and made its way out. Well, that's good news. It means we've got rid of him. Grandfather was quite enthusiastic about this development, but not grandma. She said, "Well, we need to be doubly sure. We've got Aunt Ruby coming in for her long summer vacation. She's going to be staying here for a really long time. I don't think she would want pythons around." And that was true. Aunt Ruby had zero tolerance for anything that was not human. So together, all of us searched the house, the garden, and the adjoining grounds and made sure that there was no python. Well, we couldn't find one, so we were pretty confident that the python had left us. Few days later, Aunt Ruby came in with bag and baggage to stay with us because it was her vacation in Lucknow where she was working as a school teacher, and few days went really very well. Until one evening when we were all sitting in the veranda having our tea, and we heard Aunt Ruby shrieking and screaming, and the next thing we saw was she was leaping up these steps and coming to us. And we were like, "What?" And all she could say was, "Ah, in the garden. I was reaching out to pluck a guava, and it was looking at me with such queer eyes as if it will eat me alive." "Ruby, Ruby, calm down. What did you see?" "A big snake in the garden." Oh. Grandfather and I quite understood what must have happened, and so we immediately rushed to find the python. But maybe Aunt Ruby frightened it away, or it must have been too quick for us. We missed it. Now we got worried. We knew the python hadn't gone, but we were not sure where it's going to show up next. Well, the next day it showed up in my room. The day after that, we saw it climb up the ladder and go to the roof. And the day after that, we found it comfortably standing in front of the dressing table mirror, admiring its reflection in Aunt Ruby's room. Well, there were hysterical screams coming from that place, and grandfather and I rushed in to lift that python and rescue it from the screams of Aunt Ruby, and this time we were quite successful. And grandfather, before disposing of the python, could not help tease Aunt Ruby, asking her, "Ruby, would you want to hold this python? It seems to have taken a fancy to you, trying to tempt you with a guava, and now it's come searching for you." Well, Aunt Ruby got so angry, so annoyed at that, she packed up her bags and immediately went back to Lucknow. Well, good riddance, that's what I thought, both of the python and Aunt Ruby. But no, I did like the python a lot, I tell you. Well, the python still didn't go away. We got used to it. And seeing grandfather so comfortably handle that thing, I also started developing a wish that I do want to hold it and feel it and carry it around with that kind of an ease. So I began by just touching it, petting it, and it felt so cold and slippery, it gave me goose pimples. But eventually I came to the point where I was actually lifting it and holding it in my arms. And actually I quite liked it. And I also think the python liked it too, because whenever I tried to put it down, it would immediately coil itself around me. So I like to think that we'd become friends. But you see, I couldn't always carry that python around. So when I had errands to do or wanted to go for a bicycle ride, I would put it inside a basket and go. One evening when I was coming back from a bicycle ride, I found that grandma was putting in guavas inside a big basket. Ooh, I kept my fingers crossed and hoped that this was a different basket, not my python basket. I dared ask her about it. So I kept quiet. Once grandma was done filling up the basket with guavas, she gave it to me and said, "Dear, this is a surprise gift for Major Malik because it's his birthday. Can you just take it to him?" And I said, "Well, sure, grandma." And I lifted the basket, mounted it on my cycle, and rode to Major Malik's home. And seeing me, he gave me quite a warm welcome, saying, "Ah, welcome. What does your kind granny send me?" And I said, "Well, she sends you a surprise for your birthday." And he was quite excited. And exactly at that moment, the python, which was buried underneath all of those guavas, chose to wake up, stand up straight, and look straight into the eyes of the major. Obviously, the major got so frightened, he rushed back inside his house and came out with a double-barreled gun to shoot it at sight. And me, fearing the worst, shut the lid of the basket, mounted it back on my cycle, and rode back home in record time and speed. And seeing me back so quick, grandma said, "So, did Major Malik like the gift? Did you deliver it to him?" And I sort of just grinned and said, "Yes. He said he'll write to you." And sure enough, he did write. He sent a thank you note that went, "Thank you so much for your lovely surprise. Obviously, you might not have known that the doctor has asked me to stay away from excitement. My blood pressure is high and the sight of your grandchild does not make it any better. All the same, I appreciate the gesture and take it all in good spirit." Grandma was quite surprised and she didn't quite understand and said, "That's quite a strange thank you letter to receive." And she asked grandfather, "Are guavas bad for blood pressure?" Well, grandfather had an inkling of what might have happened. So he said, "Well, not by themselves, but along with a few other things, they can be very upsetting." Well, Days went by, the python remained with us, entertaining us. But sure enough, it could not always go wherever we went. Say, for instance, when we wanted to visit Lucknow and stay at Aunt Ruby's place, there was absolutely no chance of the python coming along with us. Just like Tutu wasn't going to join us in the journey. But Grandma made an exception for Popoy. She said, well, Popoy is not a pet, Popoy is family. Wow. So Major Malik dropped us all at the station, and Popoy created lots of confusion by whistling now and then, making people think that the train has left or a train is arriving, when it was neither of the case. And finally, when our train came in, we boarded, and after settling us down in our berths, Major Malik left. And the journey started, and I was of course quite excited to be traveling by train. It's a dream for every child. It's something that they all like. And when it was evening, late evening, I told Grandma I'm feeling hungry. She said, well, I'm not, I'm off to sleep, but I've got food packed in that big basket underneath your seat. I've got stuffed samosas, omelets, tandoori chicken. So just pull it out, have your pick, eat your fill. That sounded quite yummy. So after Grandma tucked herself to sleep, I pulled out the basket, opened the lid, and told Grandfather, Grandpa, the python has eaten our dinner. And Grandfather said, nonsense. Pythons don't eat omelets and samosas and chicken. They like their food live. Wait a minute. Did you say python? Well, we mixed up the baskets. The food went with Major Malik and the python came to us. Revenge is sure sweet, huh? Well, Grandfather told me not to mention about it to Grandmother, otherwise she will think we have done it on purpose. So I got the point. I pushed the basket in and went back to sleep, with a promise from Grandfather that he'll buy me some pakoras from the next station. But we were not going to have any sleep. For around midnight, we heard screams of, snake! Snake! coming from the end of the corridor. Sure enough, upon checking the basket, we found the python gone. So Grandfather immediately made a rush to the end of the corridor. And there, he found lots of people huddled together outside the toilet. And he asked, anything wrong? Can I help you? I know all about snakes. And they said, there's a big snake inside the toilet. We can't go inside. And I said, oh, well, I'll have a look. And he opened the door of the toilet and surprise, surprise, no python. It had escaped through the ventilator. So shutting the door of the toilet locked, Grandfather looked at the people, frightened people, and said, well, it was just a young harmless snake, a young fellow, and he's now gone. You don't have anything to worry. And we came back to our seats to find that Grandmother was awake and giving us a nasty stare as if to say, I knew you would do this. We're like, I swear we didn't. It was a mistake. It was a mix-up. And we were arguing and debating this when the train suddenly came to a halt, which was a surprise because there was no station in sight. The engine driver instinct in my grandfather came alive and he said, maybe there's something wrong with the engine. Let me just go and check. And he got out and rushed towards the engine. And I, of course, could not be left behind. I ran behind him. And by the time I reached the engine, I could see that Grandfather was trying to get the engine driver to speak to him with no success. What's wrong? Can I help you? I know all about engines. No response. Grandfather then carefully looked at the driver and realized the reason why he was looking like a stone. Coiled around his legs was a python. Grandfather swiftly uncoiled the python, dumped it onto my hands, asked me to sit still, quiet, while he took over from the engine driver and started to drive the train. And he drove with great gusto and excitement to make up for the lost time, so that next day morning we arrived in Lucknow 20 minutes before time. Obviously, the station master wanted an explanation as to why all these things happened, and well, he turned out to be an old friend. So, over cups of tea, grandfather explained everything. And soon we were on our way to Aunt Ruby's home. Aunt Ruby had come to receive us at the station, and seeing the big basket became super excited. And she told me, it's been such a long time since I've had anything made by Grandma. I am dying to have some good food. Can I have that basket? I was like, no. It's, I'll hold it. No. Let me just have a look at it. What's inside? I need to know. No. Aunt Ruby, why don't you look at the other bags? I'll hold this one. No, I just can't wait to eat what's in that basket. Yeah. And we just tried our best to keep it away from her by passing it on to one another between Grandpa, Grandma, and me. And somehow, with all this, with our hacks and tricks and trips, we managed to reach home, Aunt Ruby's home. And there she said, well, I've really not cooked something great for breakfast, but I don't think that should be a worry. We'll supplement it with whatever you've got in that basket. Let me open it. And like, no, Aunt Ruby, it doesn't have what you think. Just leave it alone. This is quite delicious. We can have that basket later on. But we were late. Aunt Ruby opened the lid of the basket, looked inside, saw what was in it, and promptly fainted. Grandfather and I took opportunity of the situation, and we immediately carried the basket out to the far end of the garden, found the pomegranate tree, of which I was very fond of, and dumped it on one of its branches and came back. So that when Aunt was awake, we showed her an empty basket and said, see? No snake. She said, no, I saw a python. No, Aunt Ruby, a snow python. You are seeing things. You're working too hard. You need to take some rest. But she was very adamant that she had seen a python. And to distract her, grandmother decided to cook some delicious lunch, and all of us had a sumptuous meal. And after a refreshing afternoon sleep, when we woke up in the evening, nobody even remembered about the python. And that's how finally the python and we got rid of each other.